The bustling city was alive with the hum of traffic. But for Jake, it felt like the world was in slow motion. He stood at the entrance of the high-rise building, staring up at the towering structure that seemed to reach for the sky. At just 16, he had never set foot in a place like this. The smell of expensive leather and polished wood hit him as he stepped inside. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't his world. But today, fate had brought him to this moment. Jake had always been the quiet, invisible kid in his small town. His life revolved around fixing things: screws, wires, phones, and today, a broken pair of glasses. It wasn't just any pair of glasses. These were Henry Westbrook's glasses, the CEO of Westbrook Enterprises, the name that dominated every newspaper, every headline, and every boardroom. Jake was terrified. His heart raced as he walked up to the receptionist. "I'm here to fix Mr. Westbrook's glasses," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist barely looked up. "Take the elevator to the top floor. He's waiting for you." Jake nodded and took a deep breath before stepping into the elevator. The doors closed behind him, and the metallic hum of the elevator was the only sound in the air. His palms were sweating, and his mind was a blur. He had heard of Henry Westbrook, the man who had everything, the man who controlled millions, who was untouchable, who never needed anything from anyone. But today, he needed Jake. Today, it was Jake's hands that would fix what had been broken. When the elevator dinged, Jake stepped out onto the top floor. He could feel the weight of the moment settling into his chest, the pressure of being in a space that wasn't meant for someone like him. He walked down a long, luxurious hallway, the walls adorned with framed art and golden plaques. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Jake could see Henry Westbrook sitting at his desk, his back turned, staring out of the window. For a moment, Jake wondered if he should turn around and walk out. What was he even doing here? But the sound of footsteps behind him reminded him of why he couldn't leave. He was here to change his life. He knocked gently. "Mr. Westbrook?" His voice was barely audible, but it carried across the quiet room. Henry turned, his eyes sharp and piercing. "Come in." Jake stepped inside, the weight of the room pressing down on him. Henry's office was everything Jake had imagined. Sleek, cold, a reflection of the power that Henry exuded. He walked up to the desk and placed the glasses carefully in front of the man who had everything. Henry's eyes scanned the glasses, then Jake. "Can you fix them?" he asked, his tone devoid of emotion. Jake nodded, his hands trembling as he took the glasses. "I can fix them," he whispered, more to himself than to Henry. As he sat down and began to work, his mind raced. This wasn't just any repair. This was his chance to prove himself, to show that he was more than the kid who lived in the shadows of his small town. This was his moment to step into a new world. But as he examined the glasses closely, he noticed something. A tiny slip of paper wedged between the cracked lens. It wasn't just a note. It was a document, folded neatly, almost hidden. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He carefully unfolded it, his fingers shaking, not sure if he should even be touching it, but curiosity pulled him in. What he saw inside the folded paper shocked him to his core. It was a legal document, a contract. But not just any contract, it was a list of names, figures, and an address that would change everything for Jake. His mind raced. He had no idea what it meant, but he knew one thing. This was no ordinary repair job. This paper, this secret was about to change his life forever. "Are you done?" Henry's voice snapped Jake out of his daze. The coldness in his tone made Jake freeze. Almost," Jake replied, quickly hiding the document back inside the glasses. He finished the repair, his hands moving faster now, driven by a rush of adrenaline. When he handed the glasses back to Henry, the CEO took them without a word. He didn't even seem to notice the subtle shift in the air. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line he couldn't return from. As he left Henry's office, he couldn't stop thinking about the paper. It wasn't just a piece of information. It was a door to something bigger, something that Jake couldn't even begin to understand. But he would. One day, he would. And when he did, he would be ready to claim the future that was now within his reach. Jake sat on the worn-out stool, his hands trembling slightly as he worked on the glasses. His fingers were used to small, quick repairs, fixing phones, toys, and gadgets for the people in his neighborhood. But these glasses were different. They weren't just an object to him. They represented something he could never have. He glanced at the office around him again, feeling so small. The cold, pristine elegance of Henry Westbrook's world felt like an insurmountable mountain. It wasn't just the polished marble floors, the gleaming windows, or the high-end decor. It was the feeling that he didn't belong here. Jake was a kid from the other side of town, the side where people scraped by, where success was a distant dream, not something tangible. But inside, Jake was still just a kid. His hands were rough, his clothes were secondhand, and his shoes were worn out from years of use. Yet there was something about him, a softness, an innocence that made him different. Despite the struggles, despite everything he had to overcome, he still believed in the kindness of people. He still believed in the idea that hard work could get him somewhere, even if that somewhere seemed out of reach. As he carefully fixed the glasses, Jake couldn't help but wonder if this was his moment. He wasn't thinking about wealth or fame, but something far simpler, a chance for respect. A chance for someone to see him as more than just a kid with no future. Maybe Henry Westbrook, this powerful, seemingly untouchable man, would see him. See that he wasn't just a fixer of broken objects, but someone who could fix lives, too. The weight of the glasses in his hands felt almost symbolic. They weren't just broken. They represented a world Jake didn't know how to enter. A world that had always been closed off to him. He wasn't supposed to be here. He didn't belong here. The thought hit him hard, but Jake pushed it away. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let his doubt take over. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of Henry Westbrook's voice. It was sharp, yet there was an edge of weariness that Jake hadn't expected. "You know," Henry began, "most people like you wouldn't even get a chance to be in this office. You should be proud. You don't understand what this place means to the people who work for me, the people who dream of a seat at this table." Jake's hands stopped for a second. He didn't know how to respond. Was Henry trying to be kind? Or was it just another way to remind him that he was an outsider, a nobody? But it wasn't the words that stung. It was the way they made Jake feel about himself. He had grown up in a neighborhood where people had to fight for every little thing. The idea that someone might look at him and see him as less than was a feeling Jake wasn't used to. But in this moment, he couldn't shake the thought that Henry was just another reminder of how far he was from where he wanted to be. Jake was innocent in the sense that he didn't yet understand the cruelty of the world. He didn't know how much power money could have over someone's life, how it could make people treat others as disposable. He didn't know that, to many, he was just another kid to be looked down upon. He still held on to the idea that good things could happen to good people. But as he worked, he began to question his own beliefs. Was that idealism just a weakness? Maybe he was just fooling himself, thinking that doing good work and staying true to himself could change anything. Maybe the world was just as cold as the glass he was trying to fix. Maybe he was destined to stay invisible, overlooked by everyone who mattered. Yet something inside him pushed against that thought. It wasn't just about fixing the glasses. It wasn't even about Henry Westbrook. It was about the fact that he could make a difference, even in a small way. Even if it was just for a moment, even if it was only about proving to himself that he could do something right. In that moment, something stirred deep inside him, a spark of hope. Jake finished fixing the glasses, carefully aligning the lenses, and securing the frame. As he handed them back to Henry, his hands shook, not just from nerves, but from the weight of everything he was feeling. It wasn't just a pair of broken glasses anymore. It was a symbol of everything he had ever wanted to change. Everything he had ever hoped for. As Henry inspected the glasses, Jake caught a glimpse of something, just for a second. Henry's face softened. For the briefest of moments, there was something almost human in his expression. It was as if he had just seen Jake for who he truly was, a boy from a different world, yet someone who could still make a difference. And that was when Jake realized something important. It wasn't about the glasses. It wasn't even about Henry. It was about Jake's own journey, his own belief that even in a world that seemed stacked against him, he had the power to change his own fate. As Jake left Henry Westbrook's office, a sense of unease washed over him. He could still feel the weight of the glasses in his hands, the delicate repair he had made, and the quiet hum of the building that seemed to echo in his mind. The whole encounter felt surreal, like something out of a dream he wasn't sure he wanted to wake up from. Jake had always been the kind of boy who believed in simple things, hard work, kindness, and the idea that if you put in enough effort, you could change your life. That was the world he grew up in. It was a world where everyone struggled, where nothing came easy, but where people helped each other when they could. His world was small, but it was real. It was safe. But walking through the halls of Westbrook Enterprises, surrounded by glass, steel, and polished marble, Jake began to question everything he had ever believed in. He felt out of place. He felt like an intruder in a world that wasn't made for someone like him. He couldn't help but think about Henry Westbrook's words, about how people like Jake never got a seat at the table, how no matter what Jake did, no matter how hard he worked, he might never have a place in a world that only rewarded those with power. The realization hit him hard. Was all his hope, all his belief in fairness, just naivete? Was it really that simple? Could a good person, someone like him, ever truly succeed in a world where the rich and powerful pulled all the strings? He had always been told that doing the right thing would lead to good results, but here he was, fixing glasses for a man who saw him as nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. For the first time in his life, Jake felt truly disillusioned. The next few days were a blur of confusion. He kept replaying the encounter in his mind. The CEO, the office, the feeling of being small, unimportant. He wondered if it was all worth it. He spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the people in his life, the ones who believed in him, the ones who loved him. But even then, a voice inside him began to grow louder, the voice of doubt. Maybe it wasn't enough to just be good. Maybe it wasn't enough to work hard. The world didn't care about people like him. He wasn't someone who could just walk into a room and change everything. He was just a kid from the wrong side of town. But Jake wasn't done yet. He couldn't be. One evening, while walking home after a long day of school, he passed the old park by the neighborhood. The swings creaked in the wind, the benches were empty, and the trees rustled with the fading light of the sunset. It was a peaceful place, a place Jake had visited countless times. He had spent hours here as a kid, lost in his own world, dreaming of a future where he would be someone more than what he was right now. The park had always been his safe space where he could think, where he could just be himself. It was in this quiet moment that Jake began to reflect on everything he had been taught, by his mother, by his teachers, by the people around him. He had been taught to work hard, to be kind, to never give up. But he had also been taught to stand up for himself, to not let others define his worth. And maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't that he was inadequate. Maybe the problem was that the world wasn't designed to see his value, to see the value of people like him. But that didn't mean he was worthless. As Jake sat on one of the old park benches, the weight of everything he had been thinking about hit him all at once. The moral awakening, the turning point, happened quietly, without fanfare. It wasn't an epiphany. It wasn't a grand moment of realization. It was a simple truth that settled into Jake's heart, a truth he had always known deep down but had been too afraid to accept. His worth wasn't defined by the world around him. In that moment, he understood that the world didn't owe him success. He had to take it. He wasn't just a product of his circumstances. He could create his own story. The broken glasses, the cold, distant CEO, the feeling of being an outsider, those things didn't have to define him. They could be the beginning of something else, something bigger. Jake stood up, his chest feeling lighter, the weight of doubt lifting for the first time in days. He had a choice. He could let the world's cynicism crush his dreams, or he could fight for what he believed in. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But Jake had something that money couldn't buy: determination. From that day on, Jake began to change. He didn't stop fixing things. He didn't stop dreaming. But he stopped asking for permission. He realized that he didn't need anyone's approval to be successful. He just needed to believe in himself. He began to see every challenge as an opportunity, not just to fix what was broken, but to change things for good. The broken glasses had been a symbol of Jake's own brokenness, but they also marked the beginning of his transformation. Jake wasn't just a boy who repaired things anymore. He was someone who would repair his own future, and from that point on, every step he took was fueled by a new sense of purpose. He was no longer invisible. He was ready to make his mark, to take what was rightfully his, and to prove to the world that no matter where you come from, you could create your own future. Weeks passed since the incident with Henry Westbrook. The memory of the broken glasses, of Jake's chance encounter with the CEO, lingered in the back of his mind. He had spent sleepless nights thinking about the moment when everything shifted inside him, the moment when he decided that he would no longer let his circumstances define him. It was as if the weight of all the struggles he had been through, the pain of his past, had finally begun to lift. But as much as he wanted to believe that the road to success would be simple from here on out, reality had other plans. Life had a way of testing you when you least expected it. One afternoon, Jake found himself back at the local workshop, a place he had come to see as both a refuge and a battleground. His hands were rough with calluses from hours spent repairing old furniture, fixing cars, and doing odd jobs just to make ends meet. The small workshop was his sanctuary, a space where he could escape the world's judgment and find his own peace. As Jake worked on a particularly difficult car repair, he heard a faint voice calling his name. He turned to see an older man, someone who worked nearby, standing at the doorway with a grim look on his face. "Jake, there's something you need to see," the man said, stepping inside. Confused but curious, Jake followed him outside to where a crowd had gathered in front of a small, rundown building. It was a local store that had been part of the neighborhood for years, an old corner shop that served everyone from the elderly to young families. But now it was being shut down. "Why are they closing it?" Jake asked, his heart sinking. He had spent many years going to that shop. It was where he bought small tools, where he had met many of his friends. The news hit him hard. "They're going to demolish it," the man explained. "The owner, Mrs. Clara, is too sick to keep it running. She can't afford the bills anymore. She's about to lose everything." Jake's mind raced. Mrs. Clara was a sweet woman who had always been kind to him. He remembered how, as a kid, she had given him a free candy bar when he had no money to pay. That kindness had stayed with him all these years. And now, to hear that the place he had cherished for so long was going to be torn down, it felt wrong. It felt like a piece of his world was slipping away. He knew that this was more than just a business being lost. It was about a community losing something important, a part of their history, their sense of togetherness. And Jake felt responsible, like he had a duty to do something. Without thinking twice, Jake rushed into the small store to see Mrs. Clara. Her once vibrant eyes were now dimmed by age and illness, and she looked frail sitting behind the counter. She smiled weakly when she saw him. "Jake, what are you doing here, dear?" she asked softly. "Mrs. Clara," Jake said, taking a deep breath. "I heard what's happening. I can't let this place go. We can't let it go. You've done so much for all of us. We'll find a way to save it." She shook her head slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. There's nothing more I can do. Jake, I'm too old. I don't have the strength to keep fighting this battle. Maybe it's just time to let go. But Jake couldn't accept that. He couldn't let her give up. Not after everything she had done for him. Not after everything he had just learned about never giving up on yourself. That was when everything clicked. This wasn't just about Mrs. Clara. This was about his own fight. This was about fighting for what you believe in, even when the world tells you it's over. It was about making a difference, even when it seemed impossible. Mrs. Clara, you've taught all of us the value of never giving up. I won't give up either. We're going to save this store. I promise. Determined to keep his word, Jake set out to make a difference. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he had to try. He reached out to people in the neighborhood, to his friends and family, anyone who would listen. He started a fundraiser, put up flyers, and began speaking to anyone who might be able to help. Slowly, but surely, the community rallied around him. People donated what they could, from small amounts of money to their time. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough to keep the store afloat, just long enough for Mrs. Clara to get the help she needed. In the weeks that followed, Jake worked harder than he ever had before. He juggled his own struggles with his new mission, running between jobs, meeting with lawyers, and talking to anyone who could help him keep the shop open. Through it all, he learned that you can't just wait for things to change. You have to make them happen. Finally, after months of hard work, Jake had raised enough money to pay off Mrs. Clara's debts and secure the store's future. The relief that washed over him was overwhelming. He had done it. He had fought for something bigger than himself, and he had won. When Mrs. Clara saw what Jake had done for her, she broke down in tears. You saved me, Jake. You saved all of us. Jake hugged her tightly, realizing in that moment that this was the true test of his character. He wasn't just fixing things anymore. He was fixing lives, and that made everything worth it. As the days passed, Jake's life became a whirlwind of work, dedication, and relentless effort. He had found himself buried under a mountain of responsibilities, not just from his own dreams, but from the promises he had made to others. He had grown from the boy who once hid behind fear into someone who now stood in the light, willing to face the world head-on, no matter the cost. But there was one thing that gnawed at him, one unspoken truth that weighed heavily on his heart. He hadn't realized it until now, but in the midst of all this newfound purpose, something had shifted in him. He had stopped thinking about his own comfort, his own desires, and was only focused on making sure others didn't lose their chance at a better life. Jake hadn't been able to spend much time with his family or friends. His days were filled with tireless work in the shop, meeting with people from the community, working late into the night, and all for the sake of a promise to save Mrs. Clara's store, to give it a future. In the silence of the night, after the others had left the shop, Jake would sit there alone, staring at the walls of the workshop. The echo of his hammer hitting nails, the scrape of metal on metal, it was all he could hear. His body ached from the long hours, but it was more than that. He felt the deep exhaustion of his spirit, too. The weight of everything he was sacrificing wasn't something that could be seen on the surface. It wasn't just his body that was worn out. It was his heart. There was a particular moment that stayed with him. One evening, when the shop was nearly empty, Jake saw his mother walking down the street, carrying a small bag of groceries. She looked tired. She had been working extra hours at the local diner to help support the family. Her hands were cracked and raw, the evidence of the years of hard work she had endured. When she saw Jake, she smiled faintly, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet sadness. Jake, she called softly. You okay? Jake forced a smile. I'm fine, Mom, just working hard. She nodded, but Jake could tell she knew better. She always knew. What you're doing here, son, she said slowly. I know you're trying to help, but you can't forget about yourself. You're pushing too hard, and I can see it. Don't lose yourself in all of this. Don't forget where you came from. But Jake didn't answer right away. He couldn't. He was torn. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that wore him down. It was the emotional weight of his choices. His mother's words struck a chord. But Jake knew. There was something deeper at play. He had to do this. For Mrs. Clara. For the community. And yes, for himself. "I know, Mom," he said quietly. "But I can't stop now. People are counting on me." She sighed, looking at him with an expression that blended pride with concern. "I understand, Jake. Just don't forget to take care of yourself." That night, after his mother left, Jake went back to the shop. He sat there, staring at the half-finished repairs, the clutter of tools, the dust in the air. But as he sat, an overwhelming wave of loneliness swept over him. The quiet sacrifice was starting to take its toll. He had given everything he had, his time, his energy, his dreams, but something was being taken from him in return. The simple joys of life, the moments he used to cherish, time with his friends, with his family, even time to rest, were slowly slipping away. The silent sacrifices he had made were beginning to feel more like chains. Yet, in his heart, Jake knew there was no turning back. He couldn't stop now. But the sacrifices weren't just emotional. They were practical too. Jake had given up his chance to further his education, turning down an opportunity to attend a technical school that would have improved his skills. It wasn't that he didn't want to go, it was just that he couldn't justify it. Mrs. Clara needed him. The shop needed him. His community, who had supported him all these years, needed him. The chance for a brighter future for himself had to take a back seat to the needs of others. One night, after another exhausting day, Jake sat in the dimly lit shop, his body aching from a day of hard work. He knew he should have gone to bed. He should have taken the night off, but he couldn't. He had to finish the repairs for the next day's order. If he didn't, everything could fall apart. As he bent over the workbench, Jake noticed a letter that had been sitting on the counter for weeks. He hadn't opened it, he didn't have the time, but it was addressed to him from the technical school. It was a scholarship offer, an invitation to start in the coming semester. Jake sat there, staring at the letter for what felt like hours. This was the moment. He could take it. He could leave everything behind, take the scholarship, and start building a future for himself. He had earned it. But something inside him stopped. He put the letter down, his hands trembling. This was his choice to make. And Jake knew he couldn't walk away now. Not when people were counting on him. Not when he had made promises he had to keep. Not when Mrs. Clara was depending on him to save the place she had worked for all her life. He didn't know if it was the right choice, but it was his choice. A silent sacrifice. One that no one would see. But one that would shape his future in ways he couldn't yet understand. As he put the letter back in the drawer, he felt something shift within him. The sacrifice was real. It hurt. It would hurt, for a long time. But Jake was learning that sometimes, to create a better tomorrow, you had to let go of something today. Jake had always been a fighter. Not in the traditional sense, not with fists or with words, but with a quiet, unyielding force that surged through him whenever he saw someone in need. It was a part of who he was, a deep-rooted instinct that came from growing up in a place where people often had to depend on each other to survive. In this moment, that fight came alive again. The threats against Mrs. Clara's shop were getting worse, and Jake could feel the walls closing in around him. It wasn't just the repairs or the financial issues anymore. It was the fear that everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was going to slip away. It wasn't just a store. It was a beacon of hope for so many, a place that had been a part of the community for decades. Jake could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing on his shoulders, but he refused to buckle under it. Not now. Not when he was so close. His protective nature kicked in hard, a wave of fierce determination that overtook everything else. He wasn't just fighting for a business anymore. He was fighting for the people who depended on it, for the community that had welcomed him when he had nothing, for the woman who had given him a second chance. There were days when the pressure seemed unbearable. He could feel the tension in the air, the anxiety that came from knowing that time was running out. But Jake pushed forward, digging deep into that well of determination he had been building his whole life. He worked late into the night, barely eating or sleeping, focusing only on one thing: keeping the shop open. Jake had always been protective of those he cared about, but now it was more than just that. It was his life's work. He knew that without this place, everything he had worked for would collapse, and so would the future he had begun to build for himself and his community. He had one goal in mind: to make sure no one lost hope. He couldn't let the same people who had helped him fall through the cracks. Not while he was still breathing. Jake stood in front of the store late one evening, watching the horizon as the last rays of the sun began to fade into the night. He saw a car pull up, a black sedan, sleek and polished, nothing like the old clunker Mrs. Clara drove. The car was a symbol of wealth and power, and Jake knew it meant trouble. The CEO who had been threatening to close the shop had arrived. His stance alone, the way he carried himself, sent a shiver down Jake's spine. Jake felt the urge to retreat, to hide in the shadows, to wait until the confrontation passed. But that wasn't who he was anymore. The old Jake, the one who doubted himself, the one who shied away from confrontation, was gone. This was the moment that defined him. The CEO stepped out of his car, his cold eyes scanning the area as if looking for weakness. Jake felt his pulse quicken, his fists clenching. He wasn't going to let this man take away what had been built through blood, sweat, and tears. He would protect this place with everything he had. Jake squared his shoulders and took a step forward, walking towards the CEO with a calm but unmistakable intensity in his eyes. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't show it. He was done with being afraid. He was done with feeling small. "Mr. Anderson," Jake said, his voice steady but forceful, "I know what you're here for. But this place, this store, it's more than just a business. It's a part of this community. It's a place that keeps people together." The CEO's gaze was cold, calculating. "I don't care about your little community, kid. I care about results. And if Clara's shop is costing me, I'll shut it down. Simple as that." Jake stepped closer, every inch of him radiating determination. "If you think I'm going to let you take this away from her, you're wrong," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet strength. "This is my fight now, and I will do whatever it takes to protect this place." The CEO laughed, dismissing Jake with a flick of his hand. "You think you can stop me? You're just a kid. You have no idea what you're up against." Jake didn't flinch. "Maybe I don't know everything, but I know what this shop means. I know what it means to the people who rely on it, and I'm not going to let you take that from them. Not without a fight." The CEO's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Jake's protective resolve had struck a chord, and he could see that Jake wasn't just some kid trying to save a store. He was a person who had something to protect, a cause worth fighting for. And that, more than anything, made Jake dangerous. That night, after the CEO had left with a warning, Jake stood in the dim light of the shop, his hands shaking, his mind racing. He knew that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But he wasn't scared anymore. He had found his purpose, a purpose stronger than anything else. He wasn't just protecting the store anymore. He was protecting the future, not just for himself, but for the community he had come to love, the people who had given him a place when he had nothing. Determination surged through him as he picked up his tools, ready to get back to work. He wouldn't let fear or doubt take over. Again, he would keep fighting, because this time, it wasn't just about fixing things. It was about building something that mattered. And with that, Jake's resolve hardened. No one was going to take this away from him. not as long as he had breath in his lungs. Jake sat in the quiet of the shop late one evening, his hands resting on the counter, the hum of the overhead lights his only company. It had been a long few weeks filled with tension, stress, and a constant battle against the overwhelming weight of his responsibility. The shop was still open, but it felt like everything was hanging by a thread. Mrs. Clara's smile, once a comforting fixture in the shop, had faded. She was tired, drained by the constant worry over the store's future, and Jake could see it in her eyes. She had always been a beacon of hope for him, but now he could feel the strain of her struggles. The guilt weighed heavily on Jake's chest. He had been so focused on fighting for the shop, for everyone around him, that he had ignored the one person who had always believed in him, Mrs. Clara. He had allowed the pressure of the fight to cloud his judgment, to push him into a corner where he believed he was alone, where he thought he had to do everything himself. But in doing so, he had neglected the very woman who had given him a chance when no one else would. He had pushed her away when she needed him the most. He ran a hand through his hair, the tension in his shoulders making it hard to breathe. He had been so determined to protect the shop, to fight for its survival, that he had lost sight of what mattered. It wasn't just about the business. It was about the people who made it worth fighting for. And now, Jake could feel the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. He had been so caught up in the fight that he had forgotten to protect the person who had given him everything. The regret was overwhelming. That night, as the clock ticked past midnight, Jake made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could make things right. He wasn't going to let his own pride and stubbornness destroy everything he cared about. The shop needed him. But more than that, Mrs. Clara needed him. She had always been there, for him. And now it was his turn to be there for her. The next morning, Jake arrived early, his mind set on one thing: redemption. He walked into the shop, his heart pounding, the weight of his earlier thoughts still fresh in his mind. Mrs. Clara was behind the counter, her face tired, but she looked up when she saw him. There was a flicker of surprise in her eyes, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw the ghost of disappointment in her expression. "Jake," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been working so hard. I appreciate it, really. But I know how much this is costing you." Jake's throat tightened at the mention of cost. He had thrown himself into this battle, thinking he could save the shop, thinking he could fix everything on his own. But now he realized that he had been blind to the toll it had taken on her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I've been selfish. I've been so focused on saving this place that I didn't realize I was losing you in the process." Mrs. Clara blinked, a hint of surprise in her eyes, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I pushed you away when you were the one who gave me everything," Jake continued, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "You didn't just give me a job. You gave me a second chance. And I've been so focused on fixing things that I forgot to protect the one thing that matters. I'm sorry." The silence that followed felt heavy, and Jake could feel his heart racing in his chest. Would she forgive him? Would she even want to? He had been so consumed by his own guilt and regret that he hadn't stopped to consider how much he had hurt her in his pursuit of redemption. He had been so focused on righting his wrongs with the shop that he had ignored the woman who had shown him what it meant to truly care. Then, slowly, Mrs. Clara walked over to him, her movements slow but deliberate. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and Jake felt the weight of her touch, light but full of meaning. "It's okay, Jake," she said softly, her voice filled with understanding. "You've been through a lot, but you're here now, and that's what matters. We all make mistakes, but it's how we move forward that counts." Jake's eyes filled with tears at her words. He had been so consumed by his own struggle, by his own fight, that he had forgotten the power of forgiveness. He had been so focused on fixing things that he had lost sight of the one thing that could truly heal him, the love and support of the people around him. I don't know how to fix everything, Jake said, his voice shaking slightly. But I'll try. I'll try to make it right. Mrs. Clara smiled gently, the weight of years of experience in her eyes. That's all anyone can ask for. Just keep moving forward, Jake. That's all any of us can do. In that moment, Jake realized that redemption wasn't about fixing everything all at once. It wasn't about making up for every mistake he had made. It was about showing up, about learning from his past, and using that knowledge to move forward. It was about understanding that even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance to make things right. From that day forward, Jake worked with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and the challenges were far from over, but he no longer carried the burden of regret. Instead, he carried the strength of redemption, the knowledge that no matter how many times he stumbled, he could always rise again. And with each step he took, he knew he wasn't alone. As Jake stood outside the shop, staring at the looming skyline of the city that felt both so close and so far away, he felt a surge of anxiety rise in his chest. The weight of the situation was crushing, yet he couldn't help but feel that something was about to shift. That there was a twist he hadn't seen coming, a revelation that would change everything. He glanced at the old, familiar storefront, the place that had seen both his rise and his struggle. It was still holding on, but just barely. The last few days had been filled with uncertainty, every decision feeling like it could make or break them. The bank was breathing down their necks, and the creditors had been relentless. Jake had been working tirelessly, trying to find a solution, but each path seemed to lead to another dead end. And now, with Mrs. Clara's health taking a turn for the worse, the burden felt almost unbearable. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not when he was so close to losing everything else. As the hours wore on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the horizon, something that would either make or break him. The anxiety gnawed at him. He had done everything he could to save the shop, but despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling that the end was near. The future of everything he had worked for felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how hard he tried, the walls kept closing in. That's when the phone rang. The ringtone broke through his thoughts like a sudden storm, loud and jarring in the silence of his own mind. He grabbed the phone with shaking hands, his heart pounding in his chest. It was an unfamiliar number. With a deep breath, he answered. Hello? His voice was tight with the tension of the moment. Jake, this is Thomas Reed. I've been trying to reach you. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it, an urgency. I have something important to discuss. Jake's pulse quickened. Thomas Reed. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He had heard rumors of the wealthy investor who had been quietly observing the local businesses, but he never thought someone like Reed would reach out to him. This was a man who had made billions, who didn't deal with small-town shops or their kind of problems. So why was he calling now? What's this about? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady, even though his heart was racing. I've been following your story, Reed continued. I know what's been going on. I've seen the way you fought for your business, and I want to help. I want to invest in your future. Jake's mind was reeling. Invest? But why? You don't even know me. There's something about your persistence, Jake, Reed replied, his voice soft but firm. I see the potential in you and your business. I see the heart behind what you're doing, and that's something rare. You've been trying to do this on your own, but sometimes the right kind of support can make all the difference. I believe I can help you take this business to heights you never imagined. Jake felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting. The weight in his chest had been replaced by a strange sensation, hope. But it was too sudden, too much to process all at once. Was this real? Could this really be happening? This doesn't make sense, Jake stammered. You've seen my shop. You've seen how bad things are. How could you possibly want to invest in this? Reed chuckled on the other end of the line. It's not about what the shop is now, Jake. It's about what it could become. You've got heart, you've got determination, and you've got the will to do what it takes. And those are the qualities I look for in a business. You're not just selling products. You're building a community, a legacy, and that's something worth investing in. Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. This was a turning point, a moment that could change everything. It felt like the first breath of fresh air after suffocating underwater. He had been drowning in his own doubts, his fears, and the crushing weight of responsibility. But now, with Reed's offer on the table, he could see a new possibility, a way out of the darkness. "Let's meet," Jake finally said, his voice more confident now, the tremor of fear replaced by the fire of possibility. "I'll be at the shop tomorrow. We can talk then." As he hung up the phone, Jake stood still for a moment, the silence surrounding him. He was unsure of what this meeting would bring, unsure if Reed's promises would lead to anything real. But one thing was certain. He couldn't ignore this chance. He had to take it, even if it scared him. This could be the breakthrough he needed, the moment that would change everything. But it was also a test. Was he ready for it? Was he ready to face the unknown and embrace the potential that had been staring him in the face all along? As the day of the meeting approached, Jake couldn't help but replay the conversation in his mind. The possibility of a future where everything he had worked for, every sacrifice he had made, could finally pay off. He could already feel the weight of hope pressing against his chest. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. But what scared him the most was the realization that, in order to seize this opportunity, he would have to let go of his old fears and doubts. He would have to trust in something bigger than himself, and that was a terrifying thought. When the day finally came, Jake arrived at the shop early, his nerves buzzing with energy. He had spent the night preparing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. As he paced the shop floor, waiting for Reed to arrive, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment that would define the rest of his life. Would he make the right choice? Would he let fear keep him from taking the leap? The sound of the doorbell ringing broke his thoughts. He turned to see Reed stepping into the shop, his presence commanding yet calm. The two men exchanged a firm handshake, and Jake felt a sense of reassurance in the touch. "I'm glad you decided to meet with me," Reed said, his tone as confident as ever. "I believe this is the beginning of something great." As they sat down to talk, Jake realized that this moment was more than just about business. It was about belief, about trusting in something bigger than himself. It was about believing in the possibility of change, even when the odds seemed impossible. And it was about taking that first step into the unknown, knowing that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most rewarding rewards. As the final moments of the meeting approached, Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of emotions flood over him. He had come so far, had faced so many obstacles, and now, at this crossroads, he stood at the precipice of a future that seemed impossible just weeks ago. His life, his business, and the future of his community, everything was about to shift, irrevocably, and he could feel the weight of that change in the pit of his stomach. But for the first time in what felt like forever, that weight wasn't one of crushing burden. It was the weight of possibility, of something greater unfolding before his eyes. Reed's offer was more than just financial support. It was the lifeline Jake had been waiting for, the chance to rebuild not just his shop, but his life. He had dreamed of a day when he could stand tall, knowing that all of his sacrifices, all of his sleepless nights would finally pay off. And now that day was within reach. But there was still so much to do, so many steps left to take. As Reed wrapped up their conversation, he leaned back in his chair and gave Jake a look that was equal parts sincere and confident. "I'm not just investing in your business, Jake," he said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "I'm investing in you. I believe in what you stand for, and I believe you're capable of so much more than you realize. So let's make it happen." Jake swallowed, feeling his throat tighten. These weren't just words. They were a promise, a bond that tied him to something greater than himself, something he had always longed for but never thought possible. His heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and fear. He had always been the one to take care of others, to shoulder the responsibility. But this was a chance to let others help him, to trust in something bigger than his own limitations. And that trust felt like both a relief and a challenge. As Reed stood up ready to leave, Jake remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the business contract in front of him. It was more than just a piece of paper. It was the key to his future. It was the ticket to a life where his dreams, the dreams he had almost abandoned, could finally come true. He had worked so hard to get here, but now he realized he didn't have to do it alone. And that realization, more than anything, filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. But there was still one more thing, one more detail that had been weighing on him. Mrs. Clara Jake's thoughts immediately turned to her. She had been his anchor, his constant, even as her health had begun to deteriorate. She had believed in him when no one else did, had given him advice when he had none. And now, in this moment of triumph, he wanted to make sure she knew just how much her support had meant to him. When he returned to the shop later that evening, the doorbell ringing as he stepped inside, Jake was greeted by the warm, familiar smell of the place. It was quieter now, almost peaceful, but there was a sense of purpose in the air. Something had changed. He walked past the displays, past the counters, and to the back room where Mrs. Clara was resting. She looked up at him as he entered, her tired eyes brightening at the sight of him. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice soft but full of curiosity. Jake smiled, sitting down beside her. "It went better than I could have imagined," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think we've got a real chance here, Clara. A chance to make everything we've worked for count." She smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I always knew you had it in you, Jake. You just had to believe in yourself." He took her hand gently, feeling the warmth in her touch, the steady beat of her heart. In that moment, he realized that this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when everything came together. It wasn't just the success of the shop, or the investment, or even the promise of a brighter future. It was the realization that the most important thing he had gained in all of this was his belief in himself. The weight of doubt and uncertainty had been lifted, replaced by the knowledge that he was worthy of the life he had always dreamed of. As the days passed and Jake's life began to change, the lessons he had learned stuck with him. He worked tirelessly alongside Reed, rebuilding the business, reimagining what it could be. And though the road wasn't always smooth, he carried with him the strength that had been forged in the crucible of hardship. He no longer feared failure, for he had learned that every setback was simply a lesson, every challenge a step forward. And as for Mrs. Clara, she became his guiding light, her wisdom and kindness shaping the future they built together. She watched as Jake grew into the leader he had always been destined to be, and in those quiet moments, as they sat together in the shop, she would smile softly, knowing that she had been part of something incredible. Jake had started as a boy who had repaired a pair of broken glasses, but he had grown into a man who was no longer afraid to see the world as it could be, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. He had discovered that the key to his future wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about believing that what he had, what he was, could be enough. And in that belief, he found the strength to rebuild not just a business, but a life worth living. And so, with clarity and hope in his heart, Jake stepped into the future, no longer burdened by the doubts of the past, but empowered by the promise of what was yet to come.